everyone, welcome back to Hearing with Haley. I've been gone for a little bit, but I thought this month was the perfect time to get back started with my videos. Black History Month is something that obviously is important to me being black, and I think it's something that has a lot of value when you look at a lot of the things that happen in history from slavery to the current, because although slavery is a dark mark on our history, there are a lot of positives that Black history has as well. So I think looking at the whole timeline is important thing to do for understanding for not just people that are black, but people of different ethnicities as well. And I think that in the country we live in, where we have such a large diversity of, races and cultures, we should do this with each other, and we should build that bridge across the races, across the cultures, so we have a better understanding of each other, and essentially be more cohesive in the future as well. So to get started this week, I'm looking at slavery. How did it start? Well, 1619 was the first record of slaves being brought across the Atlantic. 20 slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, and this essentially sparked a huge market for slaves. During the 18th century alone, we have 67 million that were recorded roughly that were brought across. Although this was practiced during the 17th and 18th century, there's no way of knowing how many slaves were actually brought across, so I think it's easy to say it's well in the millions of the amount of slaves that were used. So what was slavery? What did it do? We have slaves that were brought over from Africa and basically stripped of everything. They were stripped of their language, stripped of their name, their culture, their religion, pretty much anything that made them feel like a human, they were stripped of. They were basically wanted to be dependent upon their masters. They needed to be dependent upon their masters to survive, and that's what their masters wanted. They took away their They couldn't, even families that were brought over from slavery, essentially when they came to the New World, they were broken apart. They were moms, dads, husbands, daughters, sons. You were no longer that. Families did not exist in the New World. As slaves, you were property. You did not have the right to claim somebody as your husband or your wife, because you were property to your slave master. Not just families were ripped apart, but you as a person were ripped apart. Your name that you had growing up was no longer your name. Your last name was no longer your last name. You had no identity in this new world because you were a slave. And it was important for the slave masters to instill that, so that lessened chances of rebellion, lessened chances of people organizing, and just created such dependency that slaves were to just work and be mindless and dependent. And I think looking back on it, it's not humorous, but to read publication that was written in 1850 as how to have the ideal slave, they had this, and this is what they used as kind of a guideline to create ideal slaves. The first step is to maintain discipline and unconditional submissiveness. The second step was to create personal inferiority so that slaves know their place. The third place was to instill fear. The fourth was to teach servants to take interest in masters' enterprise. And fifth was to prevent access from education, recreation, to ensure that slaves remain uneducated, helpless, and dependent. And I think it's important to note how the masters knew how to keep slaves dependent. They physically instilled fear. These were the beatings, mutilations, burnings, the anything they could do to inflict pain physically, they would do that. Just to kill them. And they would often do this in front of other slaves, so slaves knew their punishment. They knew what would happen if they tried to run away, if they tried to talk back, if they tried to look at the master in a way they didn't want to. They were subjugated to anything from being whipped 40 times to being killed. However the master felt, they were to be killed. And this, who decided how their slaves were going to be treated? A lot of times was done by the overseers. But say if the master's son did something and they blamed the slave would be punished. If the wife felt threatened by a female slave, they would be punished. Really, anything that a white person said about a slave would be done to the slave. It did not matter, because they were property. And that was just the physical. We can look at the sexual things that were done to slaves. Women were subjugated to sexual harassment, sexual abuse, a lot of the times by the slave masters and overseers, and this was done without a care. This was done as if, they had no right, because they didn't have a right. They were property, and if the slave master wanted to rape you, he was going to rape you. If you resisted, you could be killed. And this was done in front of their kids, the slaves' kids, the slaves' husbands, because marriage was not a right at this time. So if your wife was going to be raped by the slave master and he wanted you to watch, you were going to watch. And if the slave was to get pregnant and you had the kid, they were still a slave, even though that they were, half white. They still were going to be slaves, and this creates another boundary that, in the black community we have with colorism. A lot of times, we have the team light skin, team dark skin. This started with slavery. Lighter skinned people were known to be in the house where they were treated a little bit better. Darker skinned people were in the fields. The lighter skin a lot of times came from being related to the slave master, being biracial. So if they were, the child of the slave master, they would sometimes be, treated a little bit better. And this created divide and created more hierarchy in the slave community that just lessened the chance of rebellion. And men were not excused from sexual assault either. A lot of times slave masters would rape the men as well because they were property and because they could. And this not only instilled fear, but it was called breaking the bull. If they felt that there was a strong male slave that had a lot of say in the community of the slaves, they would do this in front of people, in front of other slaves, to break them, to make them know that, to make all the slaves know that you are still property. You don't matter here. You are you are all slaves, and if I want to do something to you, it will happen. And mentally, what this did mentally, slaves could not read, they could not write. If you were caught doing any of these things, you could be killed. They did not want slaves to be educated at all. Your religion that you had, you do not have that. So it was important for the slave masters to keep the slaves dependent and inferior. They wanted them to know that they were less than, they were inferior to them. They had no right to speak their mind, to speak their opinion. They had no right to be a person. And this was instilled by the law with the 3/5 Act. Slaves were eventually given the right to be 3/5 of a person, but this was only due to the population that created by the slaves. Slaves became basically a third of the South's population, and slave states wanted to use this to have more votes. That is the only reason why slaves are even counted as 3/5 of a person. And I think it's important that a Alabama court actually stated this, ruling that slaves are rational beings. They are capable of committing crimes, and in reference to acts which are crimes, are regarded as persons. So if they do a crime, at that point they are considered a person. However, because they are slaves, they are incapable of performing civil acts, and in reference to all such, they are things, not persons. So it's interesting that when it comes to civil acts, slaves are not people. But if it's a crime, at that point they are a person. So slaves, I guess, have the sense to do crime, but no sense to do civil acts. And I think that having that mindset and that something instilled in you as a slave over and over, that you are not a person, you're not worthy enough to be a person. All you can do crimes, but you are not a person. That has an effect mentally on your psyche as a slave. And looking at this, I didn't even realize this, but black people actually at this point have been free, were slaves longer than we have been free. So what is that saying? Most black people in America are 2 to 3 generations from slavery. So again, this is not me being a slave, this is not my mom being a slave, but 3 generations ago, we're looking at possible slavery. Although there was, the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of slaves, 3 million slaves were free. This didn't end slavery officially. We still had a lot of people that were considered slaves. Maybe they were paid a little bit since it was legally illegal to have slaves, but their psyche they were slaves mentally. And if this is all you have nowhere to go. You don't have a savings account. Where do you go? You might not have family. You're just supposed to, you don't have education, you can't read, you can't write, and you're supposed to just leave and start something for yourself with no self-worth. How is anyone supposed to do that? And I think that's important when looking at today. It's easy to see how this trickles down to where we are today with some of the issues that I think the Black community deals with when we come to a lot of the violence and the violence that we sometimes do to each other. And I think it all has an effect from slavery, and that self-worth that we did not have as slaves because we couldn't have has trickled down into the psyche of the current state. And I think that there are some things that are, a lot of things are done better, and there are a lot of ways to get from that and to move away from that. But I think it's important to note that a lot of the physical, mental, sexual abuse that were done to slaves, and we are the product of that. We are the product of rape. We are the product of mental abuse. We're the product of physical abuse. These were all things that were done to our ancestors, and that, in some effect, have an effect on us now. So I think that this is the first start of this 4-week, I guess, I'm going to call it a mini-series because it sounds important when it's a mini-series. A 4-week mini-series on Black history. Again, this is not some of me trying to, live in the past. I just think it's important to look at the past and look at it with the truth, with honesty, and look at it for what it's worth and see how it affects the current. And this is something that I want to do and I think is important, and I will continue doing it this entire month. So I look forward to seeing you guys next week.